Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm here with Mr. John R. Miles, the author of Passion Struck. Uh, Mr. Miles is a former military man, and now he is the owner of the Passion Struck podcast, author of the Passion Struck book, which I did a review on. Mr. Miles, how are you doing today?
And I am doing so great. And it is such an honor to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Before we start, can you just tell the viewers just a little bit general about yourself?
Yeah, I grew up in York, Pennsylvania, which, if you're not familiar with Pennsylvania, sits kind of in the south central portion of Pennsylvania, pretty close to Lancaster and Harrisburg. And living in the mid Atlantic was a great upbringing because you were so close to such amazing cities such as New York City,
Mhm.
Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. So always on the weekends, we were out and about exploring. And my parents used to take us to see all kinds of historical things, which was really cool. And as I was transitioning from high school to college, like you and I were discussing before this, I always thought I was going to go to the University of Michigan. I ended up getting in, and I even had a track scholarship to go. But I also applied to the Naval Academy. And when I got my appointment to go there, I decided to follow in the footsteps of my father and my grandfather and make the decision to serve and spent a number of years in the military. And I had a really fun time. I worked for the National Security Agency as an information warfare officer. And that really sprung about my corporate career in information technology because I learned so many of the fundamentals during that position that it got me right into information security and then into technology, software development, infrastructure, et cetera. And did that for about 20 years, ended up being the CIO for a couple of companies and the CEO for a few companies. And then about 7, 8 years ago, I pivoted into what I'm doing today with Passion Struck and the podcast, the book, and keynoting and all those things.
Perfect. So you already answered one of my questions. It's going to be why the military, but with the military experience, what do you think makes it so that so many people, when they go to the military, when they transition out, they always have pretty successful careers in all their other endeavors? What do you think translates from the military to the civilian world that so many people find success?
The military certainly doesn't make it easy for you. I
Hmm.
I still talk to people who are transitioning now who say it's no easier to transition now than it was when I was getting out. But I think once vets do get out, a couple things that kind of magnify their trajectory is they embrace the suck, meaning I think we're trained in the military to endure periods of pain and suffering, and we come to the realization that that is just part of the road to getting to where you need to be in life. I think
Hmm.
the other thing is having a never quit attitude. So no matter what is thrown at us, whether that's some type of adversity or difficulty finding a job, most of the veterans I know are going to stick with it until they find that calling and move to the next thing. And then I think we all know the value of teamwork and the people we work with. It's very hard to replicate what we had in the military, but I know that most of the veterans I know are also good with people and understand motivation and how to get people to do the things that they might not desire to do, but we need them to do. So those would be some of the things I would bring up.
In the military, is there a particular experience that you would maybe call your favorite or something that you still hold on to this day specifically?
And I had a lot of great experiences. I would say the most rewarding experience I had was the last tour of duty I was on is at a command that's now called Joint Interagency Task Force South, JATF South for short, and it falls under the Southern Command. And this was a really cool base command that many people don't know about. It's actually located in Key West,
Hmm.
Florida. It's run by a two-star, when I was there, either Navy admiral or a Coast Guard admiral. We had one of each, but the command is responsible for counter drug interdiction now globally and controlled all the assets that were doing it. So, what I really liked about this command is you could come into your shift 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, and oftentimes by the time you left, you'd have an interdiction. And so it was very rewarding, the fast pace, and that you could see a result of your work sometimes even in a single day,
Mhm.
most often in a week or a month. And that was really rewarding. And it was also a fantastic experience being in my 20s and getting to brief the dignitaries that came through. Because given that we were in Key West, a lot of Congress, admirals and generals, even the vice president, cabinet members would come in, go through the briefings, and they kind of treated it as a timeshare experience because
Mhm.
they went through the mandatory briefing and then they'd get to do vacation the rest of the time they were there. But for
Right.
me, it was really fun doing those briefings.
What was the reason that you decided to retire or leave the military and go on to civilian jobs?
Out of that command, I was approached by various three-letter organizations because in this joint command, everyone was present there: DEA, FBI, customs, I mean, you name it.
Hmm.
And so I applied to a number of them. And after going through these lengthy application processes, I found that the FBI held the most promise for me. And that's what I decided to do. And unfortunately, about a week, not even that long, a couple days before I was supposed to report to Quantico,
Hmm.
Congress couldn't pass the budget. It was one of the first times that this ever happened. And my class got recycled. And I thought it was going to be a no big deal type of event. But it turned out that it was almost 38 months later that the class eventually came around again. And of course, no one can wait that long. So I had pivoted to a plan B and had started working a job for a company called Booz Allen. And at this point was living in San Diego.
With your switch into corporate America, what would you say it specifically took for you to rise the ranks? And is there any like specific companies that you think you put your best work into?
I think the key to success in corporate America is probably the key to success if you want to be an investment banker like yourself, a doctor, an attorney, someone in the military, someone in one of those federal agencies that I talked about or elsewhere. It's the power of something I talk about in the book, which is you've got to be really intentional about the life that you're trying to craft. And so even when I was a consultant, I had long-term aspirations about where I wanted to go. And
Mhm.
for me, it was thinking about that long-term view. But as I talk about in the book, the bee and turtle effect, it's was then figuring out what were the micro steps that I needed to take at any position in my career that got me closer to the long-term goal of becoming, in my case, at first I wanted to be a CIO and then
Mhm.
eventually a CEO. And so I sought out the responsibilities along the way that I thought were going to best prepare me and position me to get the roles that I wanted later in life. So it was understanding that career track, what my weaknesses were and where I needed to fill in those gaps, and then to execute on it. And as far as some of my favorite experiences, I had a great experience working for a company called Lendlease, which was at the time that I was with them, they were about 11 or 12 billion in revenue. They were based out of Sydney, Australia, and it was my first experience working in a global company. We had offices in about 45 different countries, and that was really exciting for me. And also, I really knew nothing about financial services or construction. And we owned the second largest bank in Australia. We had a large mutual fund business. We had a real estate investment trust. And then we had hundreds of construction projects, everything from uh, rebuilding the World Trade Center to building football stadiums
Mm.
and skyscrapers throughout so many countries around the world, and getting to go see all those different project sites and understanding the whole business model was extremely rewarding for me. And during my time there, we also won the Network World Magazine Project of the Year for a project that I was fortunate enough to lead. So that really boosted my career, and we were on the front cover of Network World and Computer World and a number of other things. So I would say that was a really fun job for me.
What was the project that won you guys on the cover?
Well, we chose to call it Project Highrise because we were trying to link it to our construction business. But what we were really aiming to do was we had to overhaul the information security practices and our infrastructure for the company. So this really entailed thinking about how we wanted to do incident management, problem management, incident response, and put in monitoring systems so that we had security protocols and infrastructure management down to each of these individual construction projects that we had globally. But the ability to look at all this centrally and understand when we either had a security event going on, or potentially a server down, or a virus spreading, or something of that sort. And so, what really I think made this project stand out is that our budget was really constrained.
Mm.
And so, oftentimes when you don't have something go your way, like getting the budget allotment that you want, it's easy to want to give up. And this was an example where we didn't end up picking the marquee vendors because we couldn't afford them. So we picked niche vendors, assembled a really strong team of these niche vendors along with our employees, and were able to build a solution that at that point had never existed before, bringing all these different disciplines together. And so that was really rewarding, and we pulled off something that no one thought we would do, and actually came in under budget. So that was really a showcase of what you can do when you understand your constraints and you work around them.
Hmm. Just out of curiosity, what are some of the football fields or sports fields that you guys built or helped build?
So one of them that you would know in the United States is the Tennessee Titans Stadium,
That's sweet.
but in the UK they did a lot of the work on Wembley and many of the other Premier League stadiums. In Sydney, they did a lot of the well, all of Australia. They did a lot of the cricket fields, the
Hmm.
Australian rules fields, pitches for rugby and other, and also for soccer as well.
When you then finally rose up the ranks, you got to the CIO position that you wanted, the CEO position that you wanted. What was the moment for you where where you had your aha moment that you kind of realized that this isn't necessarily my true passion and then started to revert towards the podcast?
Eric, so one of the things I would say is that for me, it didn't just come out of nowhere. I had this sense that was building. After I left Lendlease, I went to Lowe's, then from Lowe's to Dell. And I think it was around that time period where I was ending my time at Lowe's, beginning the time at Dell, that I started to hear this inner voice inside that was telling me that the path I was on was not the eventual path that I was destined to go down.
Hmm.
And I think it's difficult, whether you're your age or you're my age at that time, to listen to that inner voice, because sometimes it's telling you something that's so distant or foreign from what you're doing that it's very hard to comprehend what it's asking you to do. In my case, I heard this voice that was telling me that I needed to go help hopeless, lonely, battered, broken, beaten, and bored of the world. And I'm sitting here as this Fortune 50 executive. Everything seems to be going great in my life. I have a couple kids, family, etc. And
Hmm.
I am trying to figure out, what does this mean? I didn't even know who I was serving
Right.
or how I was supposed to serve them or anything like that. And I think when you get those callings, it's natural to want to resist them. And I think the key to understanding it, which is would be the same key for understanding your purpose in life, your why, is you really have to do a lot of introspection. You have to spend a lot of time with yourself and start really putting that vision in your mind and thinking about what your innate talents are and kind of backing into it, given who I am, what my talents are, how would I even approach going to serve this group of people? How would I do it? What would I do? Then I think the more you explore that, it becomes clearer who that group of people are and how you can go about helping them. And for me, it really came down to the fact that I think a lot of the rituals that we have in our lives are changing. I remember growing up for me, uh, religion was an extremely important part of everything that we
Right.
did. And back in the 90s, somewhere between 80 to 90% of America identified with Christian religion. Today, I think it's less than 50%. And so that's just an example of how rituals change. But I think we are performing so many more of the rituals that we have now based on politics, based on ideologies, based on what's happening in social networks and other
Mhm.
things like that, that it's really changing a lot of the rituals that we have in our life. And I think when these rituals start changing like that, it has a real major impact on our sense of mattering, the significance we feel in our lives, why we're getting up in the morning to do the things we do. And to me, it became an existential epidemic of people unmattering. And
Mhm.
so, and when you're in this state of unmattering, you feel apathetic, or another way to think about that is indifferent. And when you're indifferent, it's to me the exact opposite of being intentional. So I thought about all those things. And if I was going to serve people to help them feel like they mattered more in life, it was then figuring out how do you start teaching people this and doing it at scale, because I was trying to impact not just the ones and twos, but I was trying to impact the masses. And
Right.
that's how I went down the path that I did.
Um, what was it particularly about maybe starting a podcast with the Passion Struck podcast? What directly led you to say, I think a podcast or, the YouTube channel is maybe the best way for me to spread my influence?
Well, it's interesting. I at first was going down the route of just writing blogs and trying to place articles in different mediums because I didn't know, quite honestly, when you're starting out, you don't really have a voice.
Mhm.
You don't really know how to articulate yourself there. I didn't have a platform. And so I was just trying to figure out what my voice was and what was going to resonate. And as things started to resonate, I started to think about the idea of writing a book. And as I originally went to agents, I kept getting turned down left and right. And it wasn't necessarily because the idea didn't hold merit. It was more in the publishing world today. I think it matters more what your platform is
Right.
and how big your audience is than it does actually the quality or the topic that you're writing about. Of course, that stuff factors in as well, but I don't think the publishers take it into as much consideration as they do if you're Michelle Obama, how big an audience she
Mhm.
has. And regardless of what she puts out, people are going to want to read it. And so,
Right.
not having a huge social following, not really having a, a key way to reach people, I started to think through, what are the best ways that I could get the message out. And at that time, it was COVID. So I tried to do virtual talks, but it's very difficult to read your audience on the other end and whether something is resonating or not. and I couldn't really do keynotes. So I thought about it and just came to the conclusion that starting a podcast, getting myself on YouTube would be the best way to start seeing if this stuff resonated and to start building a community. And so that took me down the path.
So your podcast and the YouTube, it's really successful. It's always up there on the alternative health charts. What do you think makes the podcast so appealing that it gained a pretty big following within a fairly small amount of time?
Yeah. So this is a question that a lot of people ask me. And they're like, well, what defines success for a podcast? And to me, it really depends. A lot of people want to look at the number of downloads that you have per episode for the show overall. Some people look at the number of episodes that you have.
Hmm.
I really think it comes down to the business that you're running and what you're trying to do with the podcast. So a great example of this is I have two friends of mine who run a great podcast here locally in Tampa Bay. Their core business is that they're recruiters. So the purpose that they want to have the podcast is so that they can reach more clients who they can do search projects with. They also are trying to keep their past clients warm. And by having them on the show, it allows them to keep having contact with them and be top of mind. And so sometimes they'll come to me and say, well, we don't have nearly the amount of episode or nearly the amount of downloads that you have, nor do they have the number of episodes. And I just tell them, well, is it keeping your business sticky? Are you growing your business because of the podcast? Is it making a financial impact? And their answer is yes. Well, then what you're doing is perfectly fine. Your metrics are different. When it came to mine, I guess what's different from theirs and mine is if you think about that, they're a community that really operates out of Tampa, Orlando, maybe a couple other cities in Florida. They're already geographically constrained. So the majority of their audience is going to come from those different cities and the people who know that the people that they put on the podcast. The difference between theirs and mine is I didn't create it for a certain geography. I created it so that it would be a global podcast.
Hmm.
And another key difference is a lot of people get into very tight niches. So you could be in the alternative health podcast space like I am, but your sole focus could be on just doing a health vertical within alternative health.
Right.
Or you could do entrepreneurship, and that's your complete lane. What I like about the decision I made is that the purpose behind Passion Struck is really to help people in all aspects of their life. So we get into physical health, we get into emotional health, we discuss financial health, relationship health, career health, spiritual health, emotional health. And so it covers so many broad topics that I can really bring on anyone from any space and talk to them about something that's going to fit the audience. And so I think it's that larger base that allows me to get more guests, and it really gives me a wider platform that more people can be drawn to it and have more appeal, rather than a niche where if I were just doing entrepreneurial podcasts, I'd get a bunch of entrepreneurs, but I wouldn't be getting necessarily yourself or someone who's not an entrepreneur or maybe someone who's past that stage in life. What I like about this is I get everyone from teenagers to senior citizens who are
Hmm.
interested in the concepts that we're teaching.
I think too, I think that's the best. I think the most podcasts that I see are the most successful are the ones that can kind of diversify because I think with most podcasts, for people who aren't celebrities who run podcasts, I mean, if you're a celebrity like the Kelsey Brothers podcast, I'm a Chiefs fan. I'm from Missouri, so like I listen to that podcast, but that podcast has its name because those two guys have a name. But then other podcasts, like there's this group of guys online called the Nelk Boys. They're already big on YouTube, but their podcast made them so much bigger because they'd bring on everyone from like Instagram influencers to like Donald Trump would come on there. So I also I think from what I've seen, a lot of podcasts that grow really fast or get a lot of views are because you're able to pull in so many people from different places. So then you're not relying on necessary, like you always want to have a core audience, I think, with anything that you do, but when you're able to attract a certain group of people here, a certain group of people here, it just gets new type of people, I think, flowing in every episode.
Yeah, I think that's going to give you more views and a larger audience for sure. I still think it comes down to what you're trying to do with your podcast and who you're trying to educate and where where your ultimate goal is that you're doing the thing to accomplish.
How do you go through the process of getting guests onto your podcast? Because you've spoken with a lot of people who are really at the top of their field when it comes to health, passion, or any specific topic that you're talking about.
I have to tell you, when you first start out, it's very difficult. Fortunate for me, I was an executive with a publication before I started the podcast. It
Hmm.
was called Bold Business. And while I was there, I served as the editor in chief for about 18 months. And I started a segment called the Bold Leader Spotlight. And what I learned from doing that, and what we would do is we created a list of 10 characteristics on what it meant to be a bold leader. And then we would try to find people that we would write articles, do interviews on that we felt met those criteria. What I learned from that is that at the beginning, it's very difficult to get people to come on a platform. You're new. A lot of people don't want to take chances on you.
Hmm.
You don't have that large an audience. They don't really think it's worth the effort to go on because it's not going to get that many eyeballs, which I think in some ways is true, but in other ways, if you're putting out good content, the eyeballs tend to follow it. And
Right.
so these articles started getting 5, 10, 15, 20, 30,000 views to them. And quickly, when we had the numbers that we could show, we started to attract a higher caliber of leader. But the other thing that I found was that when you bring on someone and you do a really good job with it, they're going to tell their friends about it. Hey, you
Hmm.
need to get on Bold Business and be a member of their Bold Leader Spotlight crew. And so it just started this self creating cycle where people would refer others that we should look at. And then it became a very easy entry because we would get introduced to the person. So I use that formula because if you want some of these A level influencers, the easiest way to get to them is if you have a mutual person who knows them and they can
Right.
introduce you to them. So I get some of mine through that. I get some of mine just by doing research on them and doing cold reach outs to them. I get some uh, by going through my agent now and asking them if they have the ability to get to someone.
Right.
And then some of them, I don't like to do a lot of pitches, but sometimes I get some really unique pitches that come to me from publicists or from the author or influencer themselves that it just sounds like it would be a great topic. But the vast majority, I'm out there researching, trying to figure out who I would want to have on the podcast. So I'm really curating the vast majority of the interviews that I do.
Obviously you don't want to like offend or pick favorites with anyone who's had on, but do you have a particular maybe favorite or like a specific interview or conversation that you've had with someone on the podcast that you think was maybe most eye-opening for you or just most engaging?
Well, I'll take it a little bit different way. I've had a few that were really meaningful to me. So one of those was Susan Cain, who's number one New York Times bestselling author. At the time, I was a relatively small podcast. I thought there's no way in the world that I'm ever going to get Susan Cain on the show. And I ended up reaching out to her months before her second book, Bittersweet, came out. And she decided to take a chance on me. And that was one of the first people of her size that I had on the show. I spent a ton of time researching it. So I made the interview as high a quality one as I could. And by having a person of her stature on it, it kind of opened the door for for Penguin Random House to be willing to have me interview other authors that were Penguin Random House authors. Plus, it gave me someone of her stature that I could go to other people and recruit them to be a guest on the podcast.
Mhm.
So, plus, I love her work on introverts because I'm an introvert myself, and her book Quiet to me was the first thing that came out that helped me self-identify with the strengths that an introvert had. Another one that was really meaningful to me is a Naval Academy classmate, friend of mine for over 30 years, agreed to come on the show. And he's not just anyone, he's a former Navy SEAL who's got a couple Bronze Stars. And he then transitioned to MIT, got a master's degree, applied for the space program, became an astronaut with NASA, and ended up being the chief astronaut before he left. And his name is Chris Cassidy. And if you ever want to see a great film about what it's like to be an astronaut, Disney filmed him doing the whole series is focused on him and his last flight that he did. I think it's called Among the Stars. And that was a fantastic interview because I was interviewing someone that I just respect a lot.
Mhm.
And I would say, man, I've had so many good ones. I always enjoy interviewing Mark Hyman. I really think he was one of the most influential people in this whole movement for functional medicine. And if a listener doesn't understand what functional medicine is, when you typically go to the doctor, they're looking at your symptoms. So you can think of this as a doctor is looking at maybe the leaf, if you're thinking of a tree, or maybe a branch. But
Mhm.
what functional medicine does is they look at the whole person as a tree. And what they're really trying to get to is what is the underlying thing or ailment that you have that is causing the symptom to appear on the leaf
Right.
that is happening deeper within the organism. And so that's what functional medicine, or they're now calling it personalized medicine, is really all about, is understanding what makes you tick uniquely. And then another really interesting episode was with Chris Palmer, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard and has been studying the link between gut health and mental health ailments. And what he found was that all the mental health ailments that we have are symptomatic of metabolic ailments. And there was a direct link. And he was really the first person to publicize that. And now they're doing a lot more research between these how important your gut health is and your metabolism is to your mental health and well-being.
Uh, that's awesome. The first thing that you said, that one resonated with me a lot because I think it was maybe 3.5 years ish ago. That was when I was kind of transitioning to like also trying to include author interviews with my channel. So I believe that's when I just straight up cold emailed Gordon Corman, who is like a middle grade novel author, and I've grown up all through like elementary school and middle school reading his books. So I was like, there's no way that he'll even see this email. He saw the email, and obviously, when you're in middle school, but at that point, especially when you're younger, I think people, especially younger authors who target middle grade kids, they care more about the love that they have for the books rather than how much them going on maybe my platform would impact his career. So when he came on, I think that for me was like the first biggest moment. It was like, whoa, like it's always possible to, get someone who you might not think is within your reach. And I think that like that specific moment, just getting to interview him. And then after that, I got to talk to Lisa McMahon, who's author of The Unwanteds, which is like top three favorite book series of all time for me. So like between those two, I think half of it is belief and like confidence within yourself that like regardless of maybe where your platform is, that you have belief that you have something to offer to these people if they're willing to come on.
Yeah, and I will tell you that I get a whole bunch of people who say no. I just wrote
Mm.
J.K. Rowling's to see if I could get Joe on the podcast, and she said no. Uh, but I've had others like Gabby Bernstein, who you might not be aware of, but she's a New York Times bestselling author, podcaster, keynote speaker, and she turned me down 12 times before she said yes.
Mhm.
So I just keep trying,
Persistence.
and you just have to keep going back because what I have found is that if it's meant to be, eventually the timing will work out, and one thing or another will pop. And sometimes it's they hear about an interview that you did with one of their friends, or maybe their friends recommend them. Or in Gabby's case, I had several of her friends on who kind of validated that I had a good show, and went into it asking good questions, etc. And so I think you've just got to keep trying.
Moving a little bit to your book, right? Because you said kind of before you started the podcast, you were writing the book, you brought it to publishers. Then obviously when I read your book, you mixed in a lot of your experience in corporate America, and then you talked a good amount on what you've learned from other people through the podcast. So then how much have you, or I guess how much rewrite did you do with the book as you started doing the podcast?
I ended up doing a lot of rewrite because the surprising thing for me was that as you go through the different principles in the book, they align themselves so well with either behavior science or psychology that it made it that much stronger to underpin them with experts that I had on the podcast. And the
Mhm.
surprising thing for me is I didn't really even hand pick them that way. I didn't go out saying I wanted to interview Ethan Cross because I knew I was going to do something about the chatter in our minds as
Mhm.
part of the chapter. It just so happened I interviewed him. And as I was interviewing him and reading his book, I was like, this absolutely resonates with the fear
Right.
confronter concept, and I can integrate it into it. Or one of the last ones I integrated was Hal Hirschfield, and I happened to do an interview with him on future self. And I just thought this whole future self aligns with the topic of life crafting and how we go about bridging the gap between our actual self and the ideal self that we want to become. So it was more in that fashion. So I would have to go back and rework the chapter to build that in, and then make sure that the chapter flew, or not flew, but flowed with that addition in it.
This might be putting you on the spot because I don't know if you like have all the 12 principles, maybe necessarily like I'm sure you probably have them memorized, but is there within the 12 principles, is there maybe a top three that you have that you think if somebody was to read the book, if nothing, they take these three specific ideas from it?
Yeah, the first one I would point them to is the 12th principle, which was the last principle I wrote, called the conscious engager. And this really came out of some long term research that I've been doing for a very long time around Stephen Covey's work, and a more recent interview that I did with Don DePani, who, for people who are listening to this who don't know who either of these people are, Stephen Covey is was a prolific writer who wrote a lot of books on how do you be better in life and how to do things better professionally. And Don DePani is a former Hindu priest or a former monk who's now a Hindu priest, who writes about the power of unwavering focus. And this chapter I thought was really important because I think so many of us today are not focusing on the right things in our life.
Mm,
And I use the analogy in this chapter of living life like a pinball, where we just bounce off of things instead of being intentionally focused on consciously engaging with the things around us, most importantly, the relationships that we have with others, and being there in the present moment with those people. So that whole chapter would be one. Another chapter I really like is the concept of originality embracer. And in this chapter, I really focus on Steve Jobs. But it was an important chapter because I think we get too much in the habit of imitating others or following the leads of others. And the people who really break through and create the most change, maybe they don't have a 100% unique idea, but they're
Hmm.
really trying to embrace originality in what they're doing. They're trying to maybe take something that they've seen before and better it and make it more original. I mean, a great way to think about this is what Starbucks did with coffee. When I was growing up, different times, the only coffee that we really had was Folgers and Maxwell House. I mean,
Uh,
that was how you thought about coffee. And then all of a sudden, this store out of Seattle starts changing everything to do with coffee. And people started buying whole bean coffee, bringing it to their house, grinding it. Coffee stores started opening up. But 20 years ago, none of that stuff existed. And it was because of them taking this concept of coffee, but taking an original approach to it. Or the other store I talk about is Amazon
mhm.
versus, and how the idea of becoming an online bookstore wasn't that original. What was original was Jeff Bezos thinking about how do we become the everything store that will carry every product under the sun. Because
Right,
even if you look at a Home Depot or a Lowe's, you might have 80,000 to 100,000 SKUs within a store, and they might have access when I was there to a million and a half SKUs. But if you look at what Amazon has done, I mean, they are serving billions and billions of products now.
right.
And so that's what really made that concept unique. And so that's another key one. And then I think one of the favorites from people who've read it is the mosquito auditor
Mhm.
chapter.
I like that one.
And I just, when I was thinking about the book and things that get in the way of where we want to go in life, you can have a sense of direction on where you want to take your life. You can start taking the steps to actualize it. But one of the first things that hits us even before fears, sometimes those inner fears hit us, is we start running into friends and family members and other people who are around us who start creating doubts in our minds about where we're trying to go to begin with. I mean, it could be as easy for you as you want to go to Princeton and you've got people in your life telling you it's not even worth you applying because you're never going to get in. You don't have this, you don't have that. And that applies to anything in our life. And so in this chapter, I go through three different types of mosquitoes: the bloodsucker, the invisible suffocator, and something I call the PETA, um, which is really a piece of work, and how you can identify with those three types of mosquitoes. And once you do, it really gives you a huge advantage because now that you can identify who these people or activities are in your life, you can recognize them. And now you have the gift of being able to do something about them.
No, I really like the mosquito on her one too. I think that's an idea that I've been seeing pop up a little more recently because there's a lot of, I think I see a lot of stuff just like on TikTok and stuff, which is, how to become a better version of yourself. And I didn't used to see as much stuff as I do now of kind of, because I think it's like a general saying of like, keep your friend circle, keep the people around you good people. And I think I really like the way you kind of just divided it into like the different types of mosquitoes of like what these type of people specifically do and how it might specifically impact you. And then basically finding ways to go away from it. Actually, like my dad, I think I showed him the book and he read just that specific chapter just because I was like, Dad, I think this is a good one. And he read that and he's like, that is absolutely true. He's like that. And he started going through like examples of his own work too. He said, I can tell you, he's like, this person, like, this is that, this is that. So I thought I'd say probably that was my favorite chapter because I think that was out of all the chapters, I think something that people can easily apply and recognize in their life.
Yeah, well, thank you. I Another one that I think that people think is obvious, but is harder to get is the chapter that I wrote on being a perspective harnesser.
Mhm.
And this one goes philosophically a little bit deeper because I was taught, so many of us in the United States are taught to think linear, which means we think kind of in terms of black and white. It's either this or that. And what I'm really trying to encourage people to think is more of the Eastern philosophy where it's both and.
Right.
So we can have both self-criticism and self-compassion. We can do things that are both good for our mind and for our body. And when you start thinking about things paradoxically, which is what that's really about, it really opens up to you for you to see the world in a completely different way.
Um, so now actually I want to talk a little bit just about basic parts of the book. I was wondering, the design right here was the design team. I just liked the design. I thought it was pretty minimalist and it works well though for the book. I don't know why, just like it works well with it.
So when you're an author, oftentimes the publishing company has a much different perspective of what they think should be on the cover than what the author does. And that's was absolutely the case that happened with me. And so the designer that the publishing company brought forth was originally showing me covers that had flowers on them,
Mhm.
like sprouting flowers. They had one where it was a paper airplane flying through the letters, showing kind of taking off and finding your passion. But none of these were really resonating. Another one was an egg that gets broken and you see footsteps walking away, which
Hmm.
they were all nifty concepts, but they weren't really equating to my brand or what
Mhm.
I really thought was a great metaphor for what I was trying to convey with Passion Struck. And so I ended up hiring 3 designers of my own, found one who understood the most what I was looking for, and then he and I probably went through 20 different examples before we came up with the flame and then started playing with it and the rest of the design. But the flame behind me actually has several meanings. It kind of starts out blue, meaning it could be someone who's stuck and or maybe at the beginning of their journey and they're just starting to try to build up that self-confidence, the
Mhm.
intentions to get to where they want to go. And then as you see it going from the blue to the orange and then eventually up to the flame, it's that journey as you're going from wherever you are to becoming passion struck. And so I thought that this really would make the cover stand out and equate to more of what I wrote about in the book.
I always ask this for you, other than, of course, you said the first time when you went to the publishers and they didn't necessarily buy in directly. When you came to this part and you started the publishing process of the book, what do you think was the hardest part of just getting the book published?
I mean, I think the hardest part was actually selecting an agent and then having that agent then pitch the book to the publisher. And then it becomes a long waiting process. So I was able to give my publisher the manuscript almost within a couple weeks of me signing the contract. And oftentimes they're waiting for months and months to get it from the author. Uh, but even with that, they have their own timetable on when they can release books because they have a lot of authors and there are only so many Tuesdays in a year. And so I think for me, hearing that it was going to be 13, 14 months out was probably the hardest part was that waiting game and then not really working on the book at all for the next 6 months.
Mhm.
And then when they wanted to work on it, then it became, well, we want the revisions back in 7 days
Mhm.
type of thing that made the turns on the book very stressful because you're having to do so much so quickly.
Right. Is there any have you started may or considered maybe writing a second book?
Yeah, I would like to write many more books. I what my agent is telling me is that how well this book does will define the next step that we take on that journey. So I'm hoping we get the books in many more people's hands. And so reviews like the one you did are very beneficial because you're attracting a completely different audience than the podcast does, which is great.
Stepping away now a little bit from the book, I had just some final wrapping up questions. Um, or I guess one is, what is the best piece of advice that you have ever received in your life?
Um, I mean, I've received so many pieces of good advice, but I would say
Top
that
three if you
one,
want.
well, I would say one of them is a quote by Oprah Winfrey that passion is energy, feel the power that comes from focusing on what excites you. And I, in my life, have had periods of time where I have been very passionate about what I'm doing, and
Mhm.
it definitely excited me to get up in the morning to do what I was doing. I've also had periods in my life where I've lost that passion or purpose for what I was doing, and so I myself have felt that sense of not having significance. I think another one came from Buddhist philosopher Dasuko Ikeda, who says, "What is defeat in life? It's not merely making a mistake. Defeat means giving up on yourself in the midst of difficulty. What is true success in life? It's winning the battle with yourself. Those who persist in the pursuit of their dreams, no matter what the hurdles, are the winners, for they have won over their weaknesses." And you asked me earlier, why do I think veterans have success in a lot of their endeavors? And I think it's that thing that I told you, it's that perseverance to overcome the things that the hurdles that appear before us and to not view them as stopping points, but merely bumps along the road. And that they're things that we have to learn to overcome. And so those are two I would say that are top of mind.
And then vice versa, I'd say maybe specifically for the younger audience, what is one, you've given a lot, but what is one piece of advice that you believe might be your best piece of advice to offer to younger people?
I would say it's to give yourself grace. Don't don't try to don't feel like you have to be perfect at everything that you're doing.
Mhm.
And I think that that is becoming a major problem with youngsters. And I saw it even in my own kids. As my daughter was trying to get into an Ivy League school, she felt like she had to take all the AP classes. She had to do all the clubs. She had to do the varsity sports. She had to do the extracurricular activities. She had to do the volunteering.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes we're too many youngsters are putting so much pressure on themselves that they're not allowing themselves to enjoy the experience of high school and life in general. And it's causing a lot of mental health issues, a lot of burnout at a younger age. And I think this uh, achievement culture that we have and perfectionism is just something that you really have to be mindful of because uh, people say life is short. When you're your age, life actually appears very long.
Right.
And I think don't rush it. Enjoy the moments that you have. And just because you might not get into that Ivy League school to begin with, don't look at that as a life or death situation, something that you have to do or you feel like you're a failure. I have met so many people. I mean, Adam Grant is a great example where, for his undergrad, he went to Michigan, which in itself is a great school. But from there, he then went to an Ivy League school. Or I've known people who started off in either in even smaller schools. And then they end up amounting to something more. And then you have some people who never even go to school or
Right.
start out at school and then quit and do something. So I think it's just really comes down to pursuing your dreams and giving yourself the grace to not have to be perfect at everything you're trying to do and not have to constantly achieve everything that you're hearing on the outside you feel like you have to achieve. Another thing I would say is be true to yourself and don't feel like you like the expectations that other people have of you and who you're supposed to and who they want you to become are your ultimate destiny, because that just brings up a whole bunch of unhappiness in your life when you're trying to live your life for someone else and you're not living it for yourself.
I love both of those two things, especially the first one for me too is something that I think and I think a lot of other just high school kids in general can connect to. I think that from the time that you hit sophomore year, junior year, there's so much pressure put on you. And I think part of it is pressure that kids put on themselves because, like you said, when you compare yourself to other people, when you kind of look at what other people are doing, I feel like people have a tendency to kind of put themselves down rather than build themselves up just because it's honestly a lot easier to do so. Like I was applying to a summer program and one of it was one of the questions was what do you think the biggest problem is affecting young people? And what I talked about was like fear of failure rather than chasing success is what motivates more people, sadly, young people, because I think the fear of messing up, the fear of not being perfect is what scares people more than rather than driving for success or striving for success. And I think these ideas are also echoed in throughout Passion Struck that, you always have to kind of look at it through the positive light. Like people always say, it's rather than saying like, I hope I don't fail, rather being like, how will I pass? Just like little small ways to view life differently. I think it just gives you a more positive outlook on it.
Yeah, and give yourself self-compassion. I mean high school is not easy. The tests that you have to do, the AP courses that kids are taking, the social pressures that people face. But life is so much different after high school.
Hmm.
And it's hard to realize that when you're in the bubble of high school. But I look back and I'm in touch with a lot more today of my college classmates than I am with my high school or
Hmm.
elementary school friends. And I think that's similar to most people. And I would say the other thing is your dreams can evolve. I think that one of the things that kids in your generation are growing up with is there's a lot more uncertainties in the future given AI, automation, the technologies transformation that we're seeing at such a more rapid pace than I did when I was your age. And so
Sure.
I think you need to go into this with the mindset that you're going to have to reinvent yourself on a consistent basis, because the most important thing that I have found in my own life is that you need to be a constant learner, because you need to stay on top of the trends and ahead of them if you really want to prevail and keep being successful throughout your lifetime.
Perfect. And then I just have one final question. I make sure to ask this to everybody. And then this would be because now you are obviously officially an author. What is one piece of advice that you would give to anyone who wants to become an author and maybe isn't sure how to take that first step?
Yeah, I would really just say that the publishing world today is very different than it was even 5 years ago. And I think the self-publishing aspect has really revolutionized how quickly you can get a book out.
Mhm.
So it really comes down to what kind of book do you want to write? Do you want to write a children's book? Do you want to write a fiction book, a nonfiction book? And then, similar to the podcast, what are you doing it for? So don't put pressure on yourself that it has to go to a publisher or it has to be a bestseller. It really comes down to what are you hoping the book does when you put it out in the world. And the other thing is is give yourself time to create it. I mean, don't I wouldn't rush the process. I think you have so much better book by taking your time and creating something that, at least for me, I write a chapter and then I probably edit it 3 or 4 times
Mhm.
before it even gets to a 80% final point. And that's the same thing I have to do with my articles that I write and the podcast episodes, etc. The way I like to write is I like to go through and get as much content as I can, thinking about the idea. Then I go back and I just refine it and refine it and refine it until it gets closer to what I'm looking for.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much, Mr. Miles, for coming on here. It was great having the conversation with you. Everybody, please read Passion Struck. I said it in my review before. You're hearing it now again. Again, it was a great book. Me as a 17-year-old, I think that it was it was great that I read it now because I think that it opens so many different ways to view life. And I think it's applicable to anybody of any age. Again, please make sure you subscribe, like the video. It's a reminder, 50% of everything that I make on this channel all goes to Friends of Kids with Cancer, local nonprofit that I've been working with for the last 3, 4 years of my life. Mr. Miles, thank you again so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. It was such an honor to be here. And thank you so much for reviewing the book. And I'm glad that it meant so much to you. That means the world to me.
Of course, thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.